Okay, in this presentation we're going to take a look at evolution and natural selection. So generally what we're looking at here is evolution. And evolution is driven by something called natural selection. And it's often something that people think of as the same thing, but it's not really the same thing. Because of natural selection, evolution occurs. And we'll try to take a closer look at that during this presentation. So let's start with the GSEs. We're just going to break it down into a bunch of different categories here. So we're still going to be paying attention to how genetic variations are passed on through reproduction. And we're also going to look at what some evidence is for evolution. And we're going to talk about how natural selection leads to evolution. And lastly, we're going to look at our understanding of how evolution has changed over time. So those are the GSEs you need on the front of your graphic organizer. So we should start by getting some of the basic vocabulary out of the way. So evolution is a theory, and it's a theory that states that organisms today have developed from more simple life forms. Okay, so they have changed over time. So species have changed over time. That's one thing that people often confuse, is they think that an organism evolves. Individual organisms don't evolve. Species evolve. Okay, so if you look at a species over thousands and thousands of years, or hundreds of generations, the 100th generation is different from the first generation because over long periods of time, small changes have occurred to that species. Okay, and the reason those changes have occurred is because of something called natural selection. So natural selection is the idea, I'm sure you've heard of, survival of the fittest. So what that means is the organisms of a species that are best adapted to their environment are able to survive and reproduce. So since they're the ones that are reproducing, they're the ones passing on their genes more often. So the gene pool becomes stronger because the genes that are being passed along are the genes of the organisms that survive the best. So they're best adapted to their environment. So the definition you see here is the one that you need in your graphic organizer. So let's take a look at how the ideas of how evolution occurs has changed over time. So there are two schools of thought. There's what people used to think, and there's what we believe to be true now. So originally people thought that the Earth was only a few thousand years old, about 6,000 years actually. But now we know that the Earth is actually billions of years old. It's over 4.5 billion years old. It's a long time. And another thing that they believed was that neither the planet or the species that lived here have changed at all. The Earth started this way, and it's always been this way and will always be this way. But now we know that that's not necessarily true. We know that the planet has changed. There are indications through fossils and geology that have shown that there have been many, many changes to the planet itself and also to life on this planet throughout these billions of years. So one popular idea was from a guy named Jean-Pierre Lamarck. And he wasn't actually that far off. He believed that organisms change their traits during their own lifetime. His example was of a giraffe. So, a giraffe is born with a certain length of neck. Over the course of their life, they try to stretch their neck out. And as they do that, their neck becomes longer and longer. So they use that certain trait so it becomes stronger in them. So he thought that it was able to then pass on that trait because it was able to grow its neck a little more. So when it had babies, those babies had that longer neck, and those babies then stretched their necks out more and more, and they passed on yet a longer neck to the next generation. So that's what he figured, is that trait was passed on, And over long periods of time, you would have this short-necked giraffe that made its neck a little bit longer, which gave birth to babies with that little bit longer neck. So over hundreds of generations, you ended up with this short, stumpy-necked giraffe that ended up with a long neck. But all those beliefs changed when this guy came along, Charles Darwin. He's actually credited with developing the theory of evolution and natural selection. So a lot of the information that he gathered came when he took this long voyage on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He spent 5 years traveling around South America and in the South Pacific, looking at different species of animals that lived in those areas and really keeping a very detailed, accurate record of his observations. So we can take a look at his trip here. He started in England up north, and he traveled south by Africa and then stopped at many different places on the coast of the east coast of South America and then the west coast of South America till he got right there where that line stops to a place called the Galapagos. Okay, it was this set of islands that are sort of way off by themselves. So this is where he really was able to piece together his theory of evolution, because each of these islands had a different environment. But the species that lived there on each of the islands were somewhat similar, but they had little changes, little differences between the species on each island. So once he finished looking there, he traveled west around the world to New Zealand and Australia, and then around the tip of Africa and back home. So it took him 5 years to complete that journey. It's a long time to be away from home. It's also a long time to gather data. So let's take a look at some of his observations. When he looked at the finches on the different islands of the Galapagos, and what he saw was that on each island there were different finches that had different beaks. So if we look at this diagram, he saw that each island had these finches that were living in the trees, okay? And some of them were eating fruit, some of them were catching insects, and you can see those on the left-hand side of this diagram. And then he compared those to the finches that lived on the ground, and those are the ones on the right side of the diagram. So the beaks were very different. The body types were the same. The birds looked very similar in terms of their body. Their coloring was slightly different, but he could see that the birds that lived on the ground that ate seeds, their beaks were designed for crushing seeds and getting to the good parts of the seeds, whereas the ones that lived in the trees that were eating fruit had beaks that were well designed for sort of tearing apart fruit or well designed for snatching insects. And if you look at the top part of the diagram, it's got those finches, and all of them have these long beaks. And the reason they had those long ones is they were able to like poke within the bark of trees to find insects. And you can see that one that's titled the cactus finch. It's got a long beak because it was sort of picking apart cactuses or grabbing insects from the cactus, and it needed to keep its face away from the spikes that were on the cactus. So each one of these birds had a trait that helped them survive. And that was one of the turning points in his journey, where he started to really recognize that since there are different environments on each of these islands, these birds that were once the same had over long periods of time changed, and they were better suited for that environment. They could survive better. So again, it goes back to passing on genes. Parents passing on genes to their offspring. So the parents that had beaks that were, let's say the ones that lived in the trees, they were good at catching bugs, okay? They had beaks that were well designed for catching bugs. They were able to eat more. They were able to survive better. So therefore, they were more likely to pass on those genes. And there were several other examples that showed that. There were different tortoises that had, each island had tortoises with very specific traits to that island. And the marine iguana was another good example of a species that had adapted to the environment, and that species was able to survive and pass on its genes. So, what was Darwin's hypothesis? Well, it was pretty simple. He hypothesized that organisms had had a common ancestor, and they had adapted, again, the species had adapted to their particular environments, and the species had changed over time. And he published his research in a book called The Origin of a Species. And what this book described was how natural selection changes species over time. So how natural selection leads to evolution. So another good example of natural selection comes from a species of moth called the peppered moth. And you can see here, these are both the same species of moth, but there are different varieties. And for natural selection to take place, you have to have different varieties of a species. Because if you don't, there's not enough differences or varieties of traits that can be passed on to the next generation, and not enough varieties of traits that could be advantageous to that species, that they could use to help them survive. So you look at these two moths, again, they're the same species, just a different variety. And the one on the left is sort of this speckled moth, and I think that's where it got its name, the peppered moth. I think it kind of looks like a little, if you were to pour pepper out on the table, it might look something like that. And then the other variety was all black. And originally, these moths lived in the forests and on the trees, and they landed on the trees. And if you were a bird, think about this right now. If you were a bird and you were looking for some food to eat, which one of those two moths are you more likely to see? I'm sure most of you picked the black moth, because the peppered one sort of blends in with the tree a little better. Well, when it happened, where there were lots and lots of these speckled type, and there were very few of the black type. So this occurred in England at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And during the Industrial Revolution, there were lots of factories in London and the outlying towns that were sort of pumping black smoke into the sky because they were burning coal in order to run their industrial plants and their industrial factories. So over a long period of time, the trees became darker and darker because a lot of the soot from those factories ended up darkening the barks of the trees. So if this were a long period of time and the bark got darker and darker, you can see what happens here. Now the speckled one is a lot easier to see, and the black one is now blending into the tree better. So what do you think happened to the number of speckled moths versus the number of the black moths in this species? Well, if you thought that maybe the birds were more likely to see the speckled one now and eat more of the speckled and less of the black ones, you're right. So let's talk about what happened there. So if we think about the gene pool of that moth, originally there were lots and lots of the speckled moth and very few of the dark ones, because the dark ones were being eaten more and more. So they didn't get a chance to pass on their genes. After the change in the color of the trees, the white ones became easier to see, and those were the ones being eaten more often, and the black ones were now the ones that were surviving and passing on their genes. So you can see that there was a definite change in the generations. So if we look at this diagram, in that first generation, this would be the first generation of moths with the black trees. There were lots of white ones and only one black one. But you can see that two of the white ones were eaten. In the next generation, it was split 50-50. There were just as many black as there were white ones. And the white ones were the ones that were eaten. And in the next generation, you can see there's a whole bunch of black ones and only one speckled one. So you can see how that species had changed from one generation to the next and to the next. And that's how evolution occurs. Because nature selected the black one as more adapted to its environment. So the black ones were more able to pass on their genes to their offspring. So for any theory to be accepted, it needs evidence. And there's lots of evidence that supports evolution. The first piece we have is what's called common ancestry. And it's the idea that if a species evolved from a common ancestor, then they should share common anatomical traits or common physical characteristics. So this picture is of several different varieties of a bird called the Hawaiian honey creeper. Kind of a weird word. And if you look at the body types, the bodies are all the same. But a lot like the finches in the Galapagos that Darwin looked at, their beaks are very different. You can see that this bird that has similar, like identical skeletons just about, and similar muscle structures have very different beaks. And the reason for that is because each one found a different niche or a different part of the ecosystem that they could take advantage of because of the shape of their beak. And they were able to survive and then pass on that trait, pass on those genes to the next generation. Okay, the next piece of evidence is what's known as homologous structures. If you look around at animals, they have similar traits, okay? Cats and dogs all have fur. That's a homologous structure, okay? It's something that they have in common. We have hair. All mammals have hair. That's a homologous structure. The idea that there are animals that share common ancestors, they should share common structures, and they do. Since all these animals came from a common ancestor, they have similar structures. Okay, they're not identical. I can hear some of you saying, no, sir, that's not right. But they have similar structures to those things. Okay? Even the whale's flipper has similar structures to the bat's wing or to the human's arm. Another piece of evidence is something called embryonic development. Now, when animal embryos begin, they all start as a single cell, okay, a fertilized egg. And that fertilized egg then splits into 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and 16, 32, and so on. And that is the same for all animals. So the embryonic development of animals is very, very similar. And even once these groups of cells become structures, let's take a look at this picture. Here's a picture of the embryo of a fish, a salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, and human. And if you look at the top row, they look very similar, don't they? So the embryonic development of all of those animals is very, very similar. So therefore, we must have shared a common ancestor. Now, if you look further and further down the list here, that middle row, there are some similarities, especially as you look at the human, rabbit, cow, and pig. There are a lot of similarities there. Okay, the chicken and the tortoise have a lot of similarities as well. And the salamander and fish have some similarities. If you think about what the tortoise and the chicken have in common, they both are born and they come from a physical egg, like you would think of an egg that you get from a store. If you look at the pig, the cow, the rabbit, and the human, we all have something in common as well. They're all mammals. And as you get down to the last line here in the bottom row, the differences start to become quite a bit more noticeable. So the idea of embryonic development being evidence for evolution is the more closely related species are, the more similar their embryonic development is. Okay, vestigial organs are organs that animals will have that are really no longer useful for that animal, but they still have them because they're sort of left over from evolution. So if we look at this diagram of a whale, you can see that inside a whale, in the back, there are leftover bones, and what those bones are a femur and a pelvis. Now, the whale does not have legs, but it still has these bones left over. And those bones are there because, evolutionarily speaking, they're similar to organisms that have those features. Some snakes actually have leg bones inside their body. So snakes had come from other reptiles that once walked and it found that slithering along the ground may have been more advantageous. So over long periods of time, if you looked at individuals of that species, one generation had these really small legs that probably folded back easily so it could slither along the ground. And then, a few generations later, those legs may have been smaller and smaller, and eventually those legs were gone. But the bones were still there. They were just inside the body. Even humans share vestigial organs with other animals. I'm sure you are all familiar with your tailbone. You know why it's called a tailbone? Because in animals that have tailbones, that's what their tail is connected to. Now, we still have the bone, but we don't have the tail anymore. So these structures were useful to the ancestors of the species, but over long periods of time, they've gone away because the animals of that species had evolved to suit their environment better. So those organs, like the tailbone of a human or the leg bones inside of a snake or the femur and pelvis inside a whale, are what's called vestigial organs. And lastly, and probably one of the best pieces of evidence for evolution, are fossils. Fossils provide a really good look into the past because we can't hop in a time machine and go back in, a million years and look at what the relatives of the snake looked like, or actually we'd have to go back hundreds of millions of years to see that, but we can't do that. But we can look at fossils. We can look at the fossil record, and that helps scientists trace how species have evolved. So here we've got a picture of sort of the evolution of aquatic mammals, marine mammals. So marine mammals actually came from an animal that once walked on land. Okay, you can see at the top of this, there was this four-legged animal, kind of looks like a rat dog. I don't know if we want to call it that, but it looks similar to a rat or a dog, and it's walking around on four legs. And many, many hundreds of generations later, it sort of looks like a furry crocodile. Okay, the body's lower to the ground, the legs are shorter, because it probably found that being in the water in coastal regions, it could find food easier that way. And over many, many more generations, you had a fully aquatic animal, which is shown in the third line down there. And that mammal then branched off into several different branches, one being whales and the other being dolphins. So the important things that we need to know from this presentation is that natural selection is what drives evolution. Okay, the survival of the fittest is what drives changes in a species. The individuals of a species that are better suited to their environment are more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. It's also important that we remember that ideas change over time. Science, through technology or new findings, changes. We know that Lamarck had the idea of the generations of the giraffe had changed, but he just didn't quite have it right as to how or why those generations were different. And we also need to remember that evolution and the evidence for evolution helps to show how species are related.